disposition. So those are the two items I have today for your lectures. Any other practical questions now? And then we'll talk briefly about your examination. Yes, Mushira?
No, I'm not speaking. I hope I
okay.
just, no, sorry for that.
All right, okay. There's a little bit of light behind me. Just hold on. Okay, that's better. The light is not behind my head. Otherwise, I'm also looking into a light. All right. So you can all see the PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, it's visible.
Thank you. Right, so this is a recap session. And so firstly, the overall objective of the course is to develop a systemic understanding of capitalism, to learn to know more about the structure of the capitalist system, or what Arrighi and Wallerstein and Silver called the world system. We're doing this in order to appreciate the limits. Let me check if we are recording. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Tandeka. To understand the limits to national policy implementation by a deeper understanding of the structural limits to our development objectives. So there's one narrative in South Africa which says that we have good policies, we have a good constitution, but our capacity is our ability to implement that. That's correct up to a point, but I'm trying to focus your understanding on a broader appreciation of the limits that we face to national policy implementation by looking at the systemic context. So we look at the structure of the capitalist system by looking at history. So many of the lectures and readings have given you a historical account and overview. We look at development discourse. We started off with the colonial conception of development, which emphasized modernization. The commissioner had a particular picture in his mind, a particular way of understanding what development looks like. And I use the term imaginary to relate to how we picture development, how we understand development, what we see in our mind's eye when we're speaking of development, what kinds of beliefs and value systems underpin our conceptions of development. And so by looking at those colonial ways of understanding development, we spoke about that was an attempt to give you a picture of the colonial imaginary and its close relationship with modernization. So the colonial imaginary had a particular conception of development, a particular understanding of development, and the idea was that from the center, all the other places and spaces where the metropole, where the British had gone, where the colonial force had gone, the colonial country, whether it was France or whether it was Belgium, that so there were different colonial powers. for Southern Africa, Britain was the most dominant colonial power, but there was also the Portuguese were also present in the region as well. So you have Anglophone Africa as well. But over time, there are these colonial imaginaries. We imagine development in a particular way, and the objective is for you to think in the 21st century. This is where we've come from. Over time, we've had these different phases of understanding development. Now, we are 20 years into the 21st century. There are a range of new issues and new development problems, and some of them are not so new. They continue from the past. What are the kinds of new issues that we are confronting, or what are the different, so the food issue, how are we confronting that? The gender issue, what has changed over time, that has remained an enduring developmental issue, having women as equal citizens, having women as active agents of economic and social development. So gender has remained a critical issue in the 21st century. And then also beginning to think about what are alternative imaginaries. How can we imagine development differently? And the point is that imagining development differently is not a choice, it's an imperative. Thinking about development differently in the 21st century is not a choice, it's something that's necessary. Why is it necessary? Because the range of environmental challenges that we are encountering is posing a threat to our livelihoods in all sorts of ways. And some have gone further, many scientists have gone further to show that our ways of living our lives, our modes of reproduction of our social lives, our modes of reproducing our economic lives can lead to the extinction of the entire human species. So these questions of thinking about development differently are not simply a choice. They are an imperative. They are something that is necessary. We've developed a set of political systems over time that relate to development in particular ways. In the current system, political system, we emphasize democratic governance, we emphasize good governance, things like accountability and transparency. But we find that even these laudable, these admirable political goals that we set up for ourselves, they run up against the walls of the structural impediments that we might have in our systems. So when we take a systemic approach, we see how these structural aspects limit our capacity to bring the kinds of progressive political, social, and economic change that we want. So history becomes an important teacher in how these systems have evolved over time, whether we're talking about food, whether we're talking about gender, or also how we have disrupted previous systems of governance, previous systems of economic modes of production, disrupted them through historical processes like colonization. And in the process of disrupting that, we have destabilized local and endogenous ways of developing, local and endogenous ways and indigenous ways as well of feeding ourselves, of housing ourselves. So we continue with the strong imprint of colonial modernization in our development agendas. And this creates problems for us because as we follow that modernization and industrialization trajectory, we also find that we are deepening our problematic relations with planet Earth. So what some of the theorists have then said is that we think of our age as the age of the Anthropocene, and they periodize that. You can go and explore that in further detail if you want. One of the articles that I've written with my PhD student, Miller and Pointer, on decolonization gives you some background on the age of the Anthropocene, the age of the human geological imprint on the planet, and how that is being questioned and challenged, and how some are saying we need a more planetary centered approach to development, and we need to ensure a reciprocal relationship with the planet. So in addition to looking at these historical systems, we also look at the systems of language, the discourse, the discursive practices that we have, the development discourse over time. And we say, this is how the language of development has changed and evolved over time. Similarly, we mention institutional and political structures. I'll come back to some of the examples in our topics on these areas. And we flag the kinds of economic development that we are undertaking. But we haven't only looked at these structures over time through language and discourse, through institutional structures, and through economic development. We've linked all of those four together. We also look at it in terms of different scales. So sometimes people think of scales as levels, geographic levels perhaps, but when I'm speaking about different scales of the systemic structure, I'm drawing on the human geographers who are very involved in trying to understand development and the issues of development. And we look at the global scale and we look at the regional scale. More recently, the shift in the 21st century is to say, go beyond the global and look at the planetary scale. See what kinds of planetary consequences and impact your dominant approaches to development are having. So it's no accident that in the period of where we become more aware of the planetary scale, that we even have territorial expansion to other planets. So as we are sitting here today, we have three expeditions to Mars. And one of the principal reasons those expeditions are happening is to see whether human beings can live and survive on those planets. What do we need most of all? One of the things that we need as human beings is water. So if we have water, we can grow food, we can find ways of scientific ways of cultivating soil and food and agriculture, but water is primary. And some of these expeditions are showing pictures, photographs of ice pockets on Mars. They're mapping areas within the geology, the geological plates of that planet, where they say there are lakes of water under that. So this is a typical example of the way in which the system of capitalism works is as it reaches structural limitations on Earth, it even goes to other planets. It does territorial expansion to other places and spaces to see whether we can colonize, take over those new places, and find new ways for humanity to live. So this is what we are thinking of when we say we look at the different scales of the systemic structure. So in terms of governance and power, we looked specific because power then becomes an important component of the systemic understanding. So we don't only want to understand what are the processes that are taking place, but we also want to understand what are the consequences for power. So when we look at food, for example, if we have a food regime that's organized around agro-monopoly and retail monopoly, and oligopolies, families of power, that tells you how power is organized in that system. And that then will explain to you why it becomes difficult when you implement a small farmer strategy, when you try to institute policies as a government to support small farmers, to support subsistence farmers, to support small and medium enterprises, the kinds of systemic structural blockages and obstacles that you can confront. So understanding the way that power works in this systemic context becomes an important objective in terms of our understanding of governance. So when we looked at how development studies has in the past tried to understand the relationship of politics and economics, we did a history of development studies. We also looked at the different economic and political emphases over time, and growth and redistribution emerged as a strong, as a pivotal global debate in the development discourse. Different ways of relating growth and redistribution to these two approaches to each other. In some phases, like in the phase of the post-1989 phase of neoliberal restructuring, the emphasis was on economic growth and development. And it said, if you can get that right, then that will trickle down to the rest of humanity. But when we looked at this history of development studies, we said, well, despite this neoliberal emphasis on economic growth and development, the trickle down didn't happen. More and more people and populations across the globe were struggling with were struggling and living and having difficult living conditions. So the Washington consensus that had emerged was then disrupted, and you had the post-Washington consensus. And we mentioned how our focus was not on national development, because we spend a lot of time often talking about national development policies. We were trying to see what are all the other kinds of things that influence national policy. So we just briefly flagged our national development plans and showed how growth and redistribution, the same kinds of economic and political concerns emerged there. The political concern around redistribution was concerns about inequality. And in the South African context, that inequality obviously took a racialized form as well, given our colonial and our apartheid history. So each phase of development has a different system of regional and global governance. When we looked at Harriet Friedman and her article on food systems and food regimes, so she uses the term regime to describe, to characterize the broader systemic features of the global food system. And she took us through those different phases where you could see how the hegemonic powers were influencing the global organization of the food system. And then you have institutional structures like the Food and Agriculture Organization, a powerful organization at the level of the global food system, formed by our general global governance system, the United Nations. So when we looked at Arrighi and Silva, we looked at the general kind of global governance system. When we went into the topics, We then looked at a particular sector. We decided to focus on the food sector, given its centrality in policy today and its importance for policy today, to demonstrate at the sectoral level how these global systems unfold. And we took that a step further and looked at the scale of the regional development. And one of the theoretical issues that came up from the Arrighi and Silver reading was that relationship between the large corporations and the state. If the state's power is delimited or constrained by global multinational corporations, that has a potential negative impact on the capacity of the state to ensure a good developmental agenda. So I'll spend a few minutes on questions and answers later on your assignment, but I repeatedly use the example of the global pandemic, where we have the global structure of the World Health Organization that's formed to govern health globally, to regulate health globally, but how evident it is in the context of the global pandemic, how powerful large multinational corporations have become. So I mentioned pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Bayer. Those kinds of organizations have had tremendous political power in determining our response to the global pandemic, in particular around the issue of the vaccine, how we produce it, how we regulate it, the issue of vaccine nationalism, where some nations did what some of the wealthier global nations had these agreements called the AMCs, which was an agreement that they would have first access and preference to the vaccine supplies. And those kinds of occurrences where some countries are able to shove themselves into the front of the queue in protecting their citizens demonstrates the ongoing global inequalities where some regions are so much stronger than other regions. And you raised those questions yourselves yesterday, where you said, where does Africa sit in all of this? Are we able to not just be pushed to the peripheries, and are we able to be less vulnerable and more powerful in the global milieu? And so in your assignment, you are being asked to then say, well, where does Africa stand in relation to the global pandemic? And you are meant to do a lot of additional research of your own to find the concrete and practical information on that. We have institutional governance structures. We have organizations like COVAX, which is providing vaccines across Africa. We have our own national plans in relation to the vaccine. How good are those plans? How well thought through are they? I think I have uploaded the lecture by Chasindi, but if I haven't, then I'll make a note to do so. I'll double check. But we have a guest lecture that I'm sharing with you, where we had someone from the presidency's office to talk to us about the vaccine rollout. She is the M&E specialist responsible for oversight of the vaccine rollout. And so she spoke and gave her perspective on what they are trying to do and what some of the impediments and limits are on what they are able to do. So we also have her PowerPoint as well. So you have those two insiders' perspectives from the government on the global pandemic from within the president's office. All right. So then We also use different, we also show the different discourse of development in each period and phase, depending on how, sorry, that sentence is incomplete. So depending on how we characterize the problem of development. So the concepts of food security and food sovereignty are one example of the discourse and language of development. We mentioned food aid, when food security, hunger, and food aid were the kinds of constellation, the terms that were brought together, and that led to a particular development policy of providing food across the globe to vulnerable areas, vulnerable countries. Increasingly, in the Raj Patel article, he then explains how they use the same term, they use the term food security, but it actually changes over time. The meaning of food security changes over time, and then different critiques are developed of the concept. So in the case of food sovereignty, that is a dominant discourse in South Africa, which challenges the power relations within food governance. And it says, Kesselman then says, we need food democracy. We need consumers to be able to have a better way of influencing the organization of the food system so that we are able to access food. But then the food security debate evolves in such a way that it also emphasizes not just the provision of sufficient food, but the provision of quality food, the provision and access to food that gives you a healthy lifestyle, that secures your wellness. And I flag the idea of food self-governance, where you govern your own body in relation to food. You don't simply get a wad of cash, money from some place where you've worked, and go somewhere else to a supermarket and buy what they have presented to you on their shelves and what they have put on your television as what you should be eating. You actually stop and think about, how do I govern this body? What is peculiar about my own body? I notice that I tend to like too much starch. Tend to like too much sugar. Well, I need to begin how to find healthier sugar substitutes. So maybe I must eat fresh grapes that will give me roughage and sugar, or raisins, or so you begin to be your own inspector, your own regulator of your body's health. So those are the ways in which the systems exist, but the content of these systems change. The content and practice of the food system changes over time. And in the food sovereignty debate, they are reflecting on a range of things related to the production of seeds before we even think about the food. Where do the seeds come from? Are the seeds genetically modified and packed with materials that are not good for our body? We don't go into a detailed discussion here of the health consequences. Okay, so we're looking good. We're over 2 p.m. and there's no break in our load shedding. So either the load shedding hasn't happened or the battery has kicked in, but for now we're still fine. I lost the point there. I was talking about the food system, and I was talking about the food sovereignty movement and conception of how the food system needs to be organized, how power needs to be organized in our food system, and saying that that food sovereignty movement looks at all the different aspects of food, beginning with things like our access to land, talking about the nature of our seeds that we get for producing food and whether, to what extent that is genetically modified, looking at things like our cattle and our poultry. Those are staples in our diet, for many of us in our diets. How are those food systems organized for cattle and the distribution of meat? What kinds of chemical products are being introduced into that? And as I said, we don't focus on the health sector, but a range of pertinent issues that relate to food and health have arisen. For example, the earlier menstruation of young women, the development of breasts at a much earlier age observed across different countries of the globe, the use of contraceptives and the contraceptives finding their way into, as they are dispelled from the human body, that finds its way into different rivers and water that is then recycled and drunk by young men, and particular developmental consequences that arise out of that. So the whole food and health nexus is a critical area of development, and so something that we really need to engage with as a priority in our development studies. The global context has phases of hegemony, governance, and hegemonic transition and chaos, which leads to, for example, the reorganization of global institutions and of the global economy. So now we see that as we find difficulties in one dominant mode economic system, or one dominant economic system of production or mode of production, we then try to find a different system so that we can continue to have profits, because so much of the system is driven by, as Sibokazi mentioned, the need to accumulate or perish. You have to continue to grow that system. I like to use Sibokazi as an example because she said that she had the most difficulty with the course, and yet it was nice to see that later on how she could engage with the issues in the course. So sorry about that, everyone, and Sibokazi. So now with the global economy, we are advancing the fourth industrial revolution as our new panacea, as our new economic growth sector. And many questions, many articles, many policy debates on what the implication of the fourth industrial revolution and the digital economy is going to be. Hegemonic power is established through global ideologies, such as an example of a dominant idea, the necessity of investment. At a particular phase in the 1980s, 1990s, there was the necessity of structural adjustment or the reduction in state spending. So we organize ourselves a governance system, a global governance system around a dominant ideological understanding. So it's not based on force primarily. There's an element of force, but it's also based on ideological, and someone mentioned yesterday, educational and cultural. It was either Monde, Mashuda, the importance of educational and cultural hegemonic ideas for the globe. And we gave some examples of that. I just flagged some of the concepts, but remember in your course outline, each topic has a list of concepts there that I wanted you to understand. So we had development discourse. We looked at political, economic, and institutional regimes to get an understanding of how all these different processes worked. We had food regimes, history, economic, and institutional arrangements. food development discourse, and then we also flagged indigenous and local alternatives to dominant food regimes and systems, and that comes out in the food sovereignty lecture. We looked at regional structures of power through regional multinationals and South Africa's own position as a sub-hegemonic power in the globe. So our theoretical framing looked at the crisis of the world system and questioned whether what has a new hegemonic power emerged, and we went back and forth on that and drew on Silva and her PhD students where they say, no, we're still in a multipolar world, which is not completely stable. There's still a period of chaos and reorganization of these hegemonic powers or these hegemonic power contestations or struggles. We understood that these things go through crises and transitions, that there's current instability, and we reflected on, when I asked you to look at figures 1 and 2 of Wallerstein and Arrighi and Silva, what you would be able to see from those tables, from those figures, is that each period of chaos has a period of warfare that goes along with it. And often that warfare would be a global conflagration. So it would be World War I, World War II. But in the current phase of instability, the threat of world war is a very dangerous threat because the technologies of war now include nuclear missiles and also forces of destabilization that could also wipe out humanity, the planet, or large parts of that planet. When you had Hiroshima in the Second World War, it destroyed part of humanity's wellness, but not the entire Europe, not the entire Africa. So the prospect of a nuclear missile war, it would be one of the most destructive outcomes and dangerous outcomes of this period of instability. And we have heard presidents of hegemonic powers or sub-hegemonic powers saying, I simply have to push a button. Well, my button is bigger than yours, quote Donald Trump. But instead, what David Harvey says is that what we are seeing is regional displacements of those crises. So as the big hegemonic powers compete against each other, these forces of instability get displaced onto particular regions of the world. So some regions experience intense and high levels of global conflict, like the Middle East, for example. So gender, where and how does this fit in? Gender has been an enduring development problem. 1/2 of the Earth's inhabitants are still suffering violent oppression. And for all the improvements in our political systems, we find that these political systems, that good governance, that democratic systems have been unable to eliminate the conditions of violence that women are living through. In the case of the global pandemic, it will be important for you to reflect on the gendered consequences of the global pandemic, because across the world, researchers, activists, NGOs are all showing that there has been an increase in gender-based violence during the global pandemic. Personally, I am the chairperson of the board of an organization called Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence, and they found that they had to shift the focus of their political work to the evacuation of women, because as we were locked down and trapped in our homes, the situations of danger and immediate danger for women and children became chronic. And so they had to shift their emphases to just trying to get the South African police force to help women get out of their homes in that kind of situation and find a temporary shelter for them. But this is not peculiar to South Africa. The exact kinds of problems you'll find reports from Ugandan NGOs and activists. You'll find reports from Polish activists. What was so innovative in the Polish context was that they used online shopping as a front for the organization of women at risk, women and children at risk. So they pretended to be selling cosmetic products and facial cosmetic products. And they developed certain code words for the severity of your situation. So, for example, if you were seriously at physical risk, then they had a question around something of, do you want alcohol in your, are you okay with alcohol in your cosmetic product? I don't know if the alcohol related to whether the man was drunk but anyway, so the man would look at what the woman is doing. She's online. Well, she's just doing what women do. She's shopping. She's doing some retail therapy, which was very different to picking up a phone and saying, please come and help me, because in South Africa, we had the experience with Rise Up of not getting to women in time and women actually being killed in that situation, or the phone call being a worse provocation to the man, because now he gets even angrier because you're informing other people of what's going on in the home. And sometimes problems of the South African police force not responding fast enough, so you know a woman's at risk, and you wait 2 hours for the police because you're not allowed to go in and evacuate. And literally the next day, the woman was dead because we had been unable to respond in time. On another occasion, our organizers just felt emotionally challenged and went in without the police because they were now afraid that if they get there too late, then the woman could be dead. So a very strange and horrible set of circumstances that the global pandemic has created in the sphere of gender. So in that discourse of development, we also saw how the language and politics of development changed, and you have some of those details in the recording on the lecture recording that has been given to you on gender and patriarchy, where we focused on things like women in development. We had the Beijing conference, the language shifts to women and development and to gender mainstreaming, and then more recently, a focus on intersectionality and patriarchy, but now an additional focus on African patriarchy with writers like Sylvia Federici, who shows how colonialism had very, very different consequences for women and men. We haven't focused much on non-conforming genders, in other words, people who don't identify as one of the two binary genders, as neither women or men. So LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, queer, trans, asexual, intersectional, etc. But those are, when we think about policies these days, we cannot simply exclude and marginalize those who are gender mainstream, those who are gender conforming. We also have to ensure that our policies don't exclude those who are gender non-conforming. So in many ways, gender is a cross-cutting issue in development that pertains across disciplines and across policies. Okay, Can I have some questions now, or just points of clarity, or any comments? And while you're thinking, I'll just get some water. Urgh. I'll come to you now, Sibukazi. So in terms of our topics, we still need to cover, we haven't properly covered topic 4. And we won't have enough time today to do that. So I want us in our revision session on Monday, I will focus some more attention on topic 4 and appeal to those of you who are unable to make Monday's revision session, Monday the 22nd. So it won't, strictly speaking, be a revision session, because in actual fact, what I've done is to bring the revision session to today's session so that those of you who are not part of Monday, so we've completed the revision session by the time you conclude your course, but we'll record Monday the 22nd session, because the way I'd like to structure your exams is to give you 3 questions, right? And out of those 3 questions, you choose 2. The first part of the first topic gives you the theoretical framing. So I would expect you to relate the first part to the more substantive areas that you have in topics 2, 3, and 4. So the questions, the 3 questions will then focus on topics 2, 3, and 4, and you will be asked to answer 2 of those essays, right? And I have to put some kind of word limit on that. But I need to think a little bit more about the word limit that we give, because this is, normally we don't have to do word limits because you are in an exam room, right? But these days you are doing your exams on your own at home. You've got access to books. So it's like an open book examination. So we'll be giving you 1 day for that examination instead of the 3 hours that you normally have. And that's to cater for any kinds of technical challenges that you might face. So the way what we did now in our recap session was to say, you've been given concepts, you've been given theoretical framings. So what you now have to do is, when you discuss the 3 topics of food, gender, and/or your third theme, which is African development and African alternatives, that you constantly utilize your concepts to discuss those issues. So I don't simply want you to, by now at postgraduate level, you should know the difference between description and analysis, right? Just a quick example. Let's take the example of Marikana, the Marikana mining massacre. So in the Marikana situation, a description would be if you tell me that there were these miners, you describe the event. They went to the top of the hill, they wanted more money, they wanted 12,000 Rand per month, they challenged the mining management, there were different trade unions that were involved, there was a response from the mining management in a particular way. That is a description, right? When you analyze, you give a thick description of what has been taking place, but you try to make sense and see what patterns exist. So you would say, well, there was a class battle between the workers who were there and the owners of those mines, right? But that class battle also had an intersectional dynamic because it wasn't only class, there was also race and gender. And the people who were at the forefront of the immediate battle were the men, the male mine workers. But when we adopt an intersectional analysis, we say what's going on at the gendered level? Was this something that just affected men? And we discover no, actually, the women and the wives and the what our society calls girlfriends, but the common law spouses, were very involved in the struggle in different ways as well, were involved in the household issues, were involved in the demands around housing, supported their husbands and partners through various kinds of protests. So you've used intersectionality to analyze the gender dynamics of that mining struggle. So when you do your food descriptions, you're also going to try and think, what are the concepts? And the concepts are laid out clearly for you in your course outline. So you're not having to flap around and think which concepts are relevant. In each of the 4 topics, you are clearly signposted as to which concepts are important for you to understand. So 3 questions, answer 2. You have 1 day to do that examination, and you're asked to be analytical in the answers to those questions. So in a way, if you were talking about spotting, you can spot 2 of the 3, right? So but you only have 3 questions. So if you don't like the food question and if you don't like the gender question, tough is because you didn't prepare the 3rd one. Although I have to say that my questions are not trick questions. I definitely don't believe in examinations being about tricks. I believe in examinations being about what we discussed in class, whether you did your readings, and then what additional information you find. So if you're just able to report what we discussed in class, then you're probably in the 50s, maybe early 60s if you write well, right? Because the lectures do cover the core readings, they engage with the core readings. If you are very strong and understand the core readings and you've done them comprehensively, you've done both Kesselman and the Raj Patel reading and the Harriet Friedman reading, then you are safe into the late 60s and early 70s. If you then bring in additional materials, then you're heading for distinction. So in my class, distinctions are very possible things. As I might have mentioned to you, they often want to pull my marks down because I grade my students, I reward my students with high grades. And so my response to them also has been is what's so magical about this last 20%? Why do we have it there and we never give it to our students? We never give them between 80 and 100. We seldom give them between 70 and 80. Why do we have those grades there? Is there something wrong with our teaching? So my approach is I give you challenging material. I expect excellence. I expect you to battle and understand it, to understand what's going on. But when I see that you've battled and you are beginning to make sense and you've mastered or mistressed the materials, you get rewarded. And then I fight in those committees for them not to lower your marks. And so you'll find if you look at my marks in some of the previous years, many people with 70s, 80s, even 90s. So I'm not a mean marker, and I'm not someone that I don't believe in exams tricking people. Exams are there to actually test that you know what you are supposed to know. And what you are supposed to know should be evident from the course and the course outline and the discussions and lectures with your lecturer. So no funny, difficult questions that you don't even know how to answer, and then you know the material, but you haven't been tested on that knowledge. So that is my pedagogic approach to testing you. Sibukazi?
Thank you, Doc. I don't even remember what I was going to ask now. Yesterday, you mentioned something about when you were lecturing under gender, feminism, and development topic. You mentioned femocratic masculinity leadership. And then you said those are the women that tend to lead like men, of which I couldn't understand what you mean by the fact that they tend to lead like men. And then later on, you spoke a bit about democratic leadership. And then you also stated something similar to democratic, that they rule like men on slide 14 of your presentation. So I was just left confused, like, what is a lady that leads like a man according to a democratic masculinity leadership approach?
My best example is Margaret Thatcher.
Oh,
okay. Yeah. So,
Iron Lady.
So I give you some examples of articles that explain democratic leadership. But one of the women I listened to in an international conference that we attended this week on transnational Black women scholars across the globe. The keynote address was by a woman called Amina Mama. And she uses this concept of femocrat or femocracy. And it relates to, I'm waiting for the whiteboard to open up. So let me use the example of race, because race and gender often overlap in the way that they manifest in our society. I haven't learned how to use this whiteboard properly. There's so many new things we have to learn as lecturers now with online. So let me just try to type her name, because you'll find it in the lecture. There we go. Amina Mama. She has two. Yeah. That's her name. She's one of our amazing Codesria women scholars. She's from Nigeria, but she's back now in the University of Ghana because she wants her scholarship to take hold in Africa, which it always has, but she wants to be based here and feel like she's making a contribution. And so this concept that Sipokazi is talking about, not a Democrat, but a femocrat. So Amina Mama uses it in the African context, but actually she didn't coin the term. The term is coined by a British political scientist, but he only spoke about it in the context of Britain. So the example, the analogy I wanted to use of race is when you change the demographics of an organization and you ensure that you are represented in terms of the demographics of that population. So you have Black representatives, white representatives, colored, Indian. So you ensure that your representation, the demographics of that representation reflect the true demographics of that society. So in the South African case, we had a white minority that was dominant in government and overrepresented in government and actually excluded the Black majority. So that's an example of demographic representation. Now, the question in relation to policies like affirmative action and issues of racial transformation are, do you transform an institution, a society, a government when you change the demographics? Does a university become transformed when it has a Black vice chancellor, more Black lecturers, etc., right? And so many argue that racial transformation or a true transformation, it is not sufficient to simply change the numbers and the composition. You actually need to change the content. So in the context of the university, if you suddenly have colored lecturers, Black lecturers, or what I prefer to speak about colored Black, African Black, right? Because some of these concepts come from apartheid years. But the point is that if we simply continue presenting to you North American scholars, North American ideas on development, Western European ideas on development, we have not truly transformed and decolonized our curriculum until we begin to look at other civilizations and the knowledges that they have to bring, East Asia, South Asia, Latin American authors, until we shift our curriculum. We haven't actually transformed our curriculum. Now, that racial example is the same in the sphere of gender. You can put a woman in place, but if she reproduces masculine styles of leadership or masculine content, if she is participating in the entrenchment of a system that prevents the full self-actualization of women, then she is not much different. And very often the cultural and political styles of the femocrat go along with the dominant masculine and patriarchal ways of organizing society. One of the key fault lines of patriarchal organization is the separation of the public and the private spheres. So women are curtailed and disciplined through institutions like marriage into the private sphere, where we carry the social load in the areas of caring, food provision, health care of our families, looking after the children. We carry the bulk of the load in the private sector, not private sector, the private space, the space of the home. In the public sector, men are visible, men are leading. So that kind of division of the public and the private in society, the public and private spaces, reinforces the oppression of women. Because when we come to work, it's a simple day at work, we have already done 2 to 3 hours of work in the morning, and when we come home from work, we're going to carry the bulk of the 2 to 4 hours of after work duties that are going to be done. That is not an equal situation between men and women, but that is still very much dominant in many homes and in many societies, whether African or Western European. So until we bring more substantial changes to those kinds of divisions. So one of the feminist responses to that way of oppressing women is to say, break that divide between public and private. The division of the public and the private has allowed men to be dominant because they are able to place most of their power in most of their activity in the public arena. So in the article that I write on ugly feminists and matriarchal leadership, I reflect on some of these issues. And what was the point I wanted to make about that? Oh, the concept that I use as well, also in the article on the Isidingoization of South African society, I speak about the accumulation of power. So I take that Marxian idea of the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of capital, and I apply it to gender. And I speak about the accumulation of power for men and how that works, and the accumulation of power for women and how that works. And what I argue is that in the way that society works, men often are concentrated in spaces where they are able to accumulate power, whereas the woman's social and economic activity often entails a large degree of dispersion of her power. She helps the daughter. She is the aunt. She is the gogo granny that looks after the abandoned kid. She plays all these different roles. And in the 21st century, we are also active economic individuals. So we are dispersing our power across different social spaces. We, through our bodies, ensure social cohesion. But yet, because of that reality, because of that social reality, we are then restricted in our capacity to accumulate power in a pinnacle position. So when we go into a pinnacle position, president, CEO, director, either we find ourselves spread across all these different social roles, or we are unhappy having to be the super women all the time, or alternatively, we eschew those roles and say, well, we're going to have nothing to do with that. I don't want to have children. I'm going to get a domestic worker that can look after my kids. I'm going to focus on this pinnacle power. And so we then reproduce the system of the division of the public and the private. So the argument about the femocrat is that she reproduces the existing power relations. Okay, so she doesn't change the existing power relations. Someone has a young comrade there. So she reproduces the gendered power relations. So although she's a woman and she's taken power, and now we see a woman in power, and we've shifted the gender demographics of power, we actually haven't changed the way that power works. What is incredibly encouraging to me in the current period is that I feel we've begun to see, well, not I feel actually, a lot of people are commenting on how there are a range of women leaders who are challenging the way that power works, the gendered and masculinist way that power works. Because when we say masculinist, we're saying that power works in a way that favors men, not women. So people like Jacinta Ardern and the kinds of things that they've done, some of the value systems of leaders are being shifted and challenged as well. So one concept I don't do with you, but if you come to masters, then we'll talk about it more. Eco-leadership as a different way of doing leadership. Matriarchal leadership, where we take the knowledge and the power of more matrifocal ways of approaching the world, matricentric ways of approaching the world. So a small example of the kinds of disruption that women are introducing in the current phase is to say, we are going to breastfeed in Parliament. So across the world, in African contexts, in Italy, in different spaces, women have taken their babies there, they've worked out their breasts and said, this breast is food. Can you see that this is actually food that has been given to reproduce the human species? Why would you tell me to hide this food? Why do you shame all aspects of our social reproduction that relate to the woman's body? So a number of very interesting ways in which feminist leadership is challenging the current power dynamics. Interesting, right? Okay, any other questions, comments, reactions? Are you disgusted? A woman leader, breastfeeding in Parliament, that's not the right place? Are you allowed to show emotion or vulnerability, or must you always be the leader that has everything always in control? Are those the best forms of leading our society, or do we need to allow greater vulnerability in the way that we do leadership? So a lot of very, very fundamental questions that are being posed to challenge what is understood as patriarchal power relations that rely on white and Black African men, not Black African, but white and African males as the systems of power that are acceptable, but systems of power that don't necessarily allow women to flourish and shape society in the way that they are able to do. You're quiet. Are you tired today?
So basically, Doc, can I just comment? In order for those women that are, let's just say, that are in leadership position, not to be able to portray that femocratic masculinity leadership, they should be able to still be possessing or maybe showing good leadership, but leadership that's not going to encourage that femocratic leadership. You can still be a leader, be in a position of leadership as a woman that you are. You must be able to show that side of a woman. Like I'm trying to understand, in order for you not to be portrayed or not to be observed or perceived as a female leader that is reflecting femocratic leadership, what exactly is one supposed to do? Are you supposed to be more empathetic? more compassionate, those kind of things, or those kind of traits?
Yeah,
are you trying to say that when you are a man, are you trying to, is this argument trying to say that men, they don't show compassion compared to women leaders that can portray those kind of traits, democratic leadership? Thanks, Doc. Sorry for wasting your time. I just want to understand that.
No, it's not wasting time. That is exactly where the debate is, because some of the feminists are saying, but you're giving us all these responsibilities. We now have to be empathetic. We have to be the people that care and share and so on. And the answer is that, in fact, you need a different leadership across the board. And so, in my understanding, matriarchal leadership, where you look at the strengths that women have to give, that empathy, sharing, emotionalism, that those qualities become something that characterizes leadership across the board. And that's why eco-leadership then is something that where it's a leadership that doesn't only facilitate the reproduction of dominance and accumulation in the way that we have it, but a leadership that thinks about how to create reciprocal relations in society within the planet. So if we are going to provide energy in a particular sector, we don't externalize I'm getting into jawbreaker terrain, but I'm tired, so sorry. You don't externalize the deleterious, the devastating consequences of the environment. You internalize them. You say, that is our responsibility. If we are producing bottles in this factory and water is coming out of this factory, and this water is floating into a community where there are children, and children are playing in these chemicals and getting sick or asthmatic because of the factory, we don't have a system where we say, that does not matter to us. We don't care about that. Our job is to accumulate or perish. No. We change the very way in which the corporation functions. We change the way in which society functions. And so an eco-leadership then requires that we are more democratic, but truly democratic in terms of the way we organize our society and understand what the needs of our society are. A masculinist leadership reproduces what exists. What exists is the accumulation of power for a few. So if you are someone that says, no, I'm not going to reinforce the accumulation of power for a few wealthy individuals, I'm not going to reinforce a power that allows men to sit on the heads of women and grow strong at the expense of the unseen labor that women do, the invisible labor that women do. So, in other words, a much more fundamental transformation. Some of those ways of being in the world, some of those feminist ways of being, come from eco-feminist understandings and practices, come from matriarchal leadership where you support a true social cohesion and care for all aspects of your society. So in that sense, there are some of us that are arguing that we need to be advocates of matriarchal leadership in order to move towards an eco-leadership. So we are saying there's a fundamental transformation of society that's required, and women have a special role to play within that because they come like workers in the 20th century who came as the subordinates and said, the system doesn't work. Turn it upside down. Learn to respect the worker. Give them dignity. Stop exploiting their bodies. In a way, women, I and others see as important social agents of change where a whole range of different qualities need to be taken on board. But we're not saying that women only should have feminine qualities. In fact, a more radical perspective on sexualities is to say that we should be allowed a free range of qualities that go from the feminist, a continuum of qualities, to the masculine. In the same way, our daughters and our sons should be able to cook food, fix cars, fix broken garages, work, do manual labor, do professional labor. We should play social roles that don't restrict us in terms of the biology of our bodies, whether we were born with one genital organ or another genital organ. Okay, so some of the institutional spaces where this kind of new thinking is coming from in South Africa is a student of mine that I mentioned to you, Dr. Babalwa Magutwana. She's the acting director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies, CWG, at NMU. And it is strong and powerful intellectual and academic movements of Black women that are leading some of this thought. And then, as you can see, it's not only at the academic level, but it's also at the level of grassroots organizations and NGOs. And there are interesting conversations and convergences between the food movements and what they are trying to advocate and these gender movements. So some powerful impetuses within society for change. But African patriarchy does not necessarily like this kind of change and is not necessarily going to help this kind of change, because if you come from a gender where you have benefited from this gendered power relations, the same way owners of companies, they benefited, the white males that were in power in ShopRite, they benefited tremendously from that racial and gendered organization of their companies. They didn't want to say that we should democratize, give shares to Black workers, give Black managers some of the benefits that white managers have. No, they resisted that change. They didn't have an interest in that change. So some of the lines of cleavage and conflict do exist today between African patriarchs and African feminists. So how would the young people say now? Boom. Okay. Any other questions on that? All right. I want to do another lecture with you today. I'll try to keep it at 30 minutes, noted, Zimkita. But I'll need to take a break before we do that lecture. I'll try to keep it a 30-minute lecture. Zimkita, yeah?
Oh, thank you, Dr. I don't know if maybe this is relevant, but then I'm trying to like listening to you. Can you hear me? Because I keep hearing an echo.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
So I'm saying as I'm listening to this discussion with from Spoga's question, I once attended this other quality committee at my work. So the HR chief director there was actually trying to explain that he went to a conference, and then in this conference they were proposing new ways of working. Like maybe if they were to allow women, coming from the point that some women have got periodical pains that are more painful than others, and others cannot cannot wake up in the morning and just rock up at work. They need to, or maybe they need to take a sick leave or something like that. So he was saying that he would like to see HR being transformed, and then maybe that being incorporated into the system whereby women have a choice of coming to work at a different time. So if this democratic leader of a woman, first of all, I think she's
We lost you there, Zimkita. First of all, you think that democratic woman? Oh, I was so interested in your point there.
what are those, like your quote? She
Okay,
needs to be a
Zimkita,
woman. She needs to be
we
more
missed you.
understanding.
Zimkita, you
No,
went
I'm
soft.
saying
You was the democratic woman.
the democratic woman is there's an expectation from her to be this strict leader who delivers at the end of the day. At the same time, she needs to also come across as being a woman on other people. So taking into account this issue of the periodical pain, how would she then deal with that matter? Would she be seen as a weak person if she says, okay, women who have this kind of a problem, maybe I expected to work from home when they have these severe pains or things like that?
Yeah.
Because I'm just finding it a bit hard to marry the two. How do you become this democratic person at the same time deliver on the expected targets?
Yeah, you have to think of the objectives of an organization differently. If you stay with the bottom line objectives of an organization, then you cannot allow women to be women. Then you want to lead like the men because there's only the bottom line that matters, right? And so it does require some serious transformation in terms of what the organization has to look like. Now, I'm on a webinar with 5 other Grootkoppe males on Wednesday night. Professor Eddie Webster is facilitating a webinar called The Repurposing of the Corporation. And we have the political economist Vishnu Padiache, we have Professor Robert van Niekerk, we have an activist, Dinga Sikwebu, and then we have a big Oxford professor, Colin Meyer, who's going to be talking, and then we have the one woman, which is me. But the topic is repurposing the corporation, and they are raising those kinds of questions because they are realizing that this race to the bottom is real, where we are just reinforcing a more cruel system of life that is undermining our quality of life all the time. Then what is the point? So in the development history, they started questioning, can we have a more humane system of capitalism? A more humane system of organizing organizations. So your HR person would be within her rights to say, look, it's been quite clear that if you just murder your workers, if you just intensify the negative working conditions, that can have a very negative outcome for the corporation. And if we want to recognize that people's physical bodies are different. One important way in which we are different is we are different in terms of our gender. Men do not bleed and pain once a month. If you watch young women and you see how debilitating those days of the month are for them, you would not be expecting them to climb other mountains on that day. You would be saying, so if we truly want gender equality, then a good HR is going to say, no, you are not equal people on that day. You are different. If she attains a productivity rate of 5 out of 10 on that day, and you as the man attain a productivity rate of 8 out of 10 on that day, you are equal. Possibly she has actually exceeded you and surpassed you. So changing those mindsets about what is acceptable and what is a good way, a system of running organizations, so that it doesn't always come at the detriment of women. In communist societies, they were so forward thinking that they said, if you want a woman to function properly, a birthing woman to function properly, you need to have her children somewhere nearby. Otherwise, she's constantly split between thinking about her work situation and worrying about whether the kids have been picked up and whether they've been fed and etc. So what they did was, first of all, to employ parental policies where it becomes clear that both the men and the women are responsible for child caring, because you both made them, you're both reproducing the human species. In fact, the woman has already done so much more by the time the child is born, carrying that in her body, that huge sack of potatoes, for 9 months. So in fact, she's already done so much more. So they said you need to have these creches at the companies, right? So the repurposing of the corporation is saying that the corporation has become a cruel space, and a space that is unwelcoming to women and doesn't allow them to thrive and be fully actualized as human beings. And we need to rethink the purpose of and the place of the corporation. Now, this relates to the Arigi and Silver reading as well, Zinkita, because they look at the phases. Other chapters in that book look at the phases of the corporation, and the topic of the chapter is the joint stock company. But as the world goes through phases of governance and hegemony and chaos and transition, right? In the phases of governance and hegemony, the corporation and institutions are often a nicer and a kinder place to be. So the capacity of the state to extend social welfare during those periods is that much stronger, that much better, because capitalism is also going through a phase of what David Harvey calls an expanded phase of reproduction, drawing on Karl Marx, right? When we go through crises, we have economic depressions, we have difficulties, companies become more ruthless, corporations and institutions become more ruthless, and life becomes that much harder for human beings, right? So one component of the reorganization of the system is to find these better ways of being, to find systems that are not as ruthless as what we are living through, that allow a woman to work from home when she's bleeding. I had this feminist friend who was the director of an NGO, and if some man came in there on the day when she was in her cycle and gave her a difficult time, she would give him one blast and say, "Do you know that I am menstruating? How dare you give me such a difficult time today? Leave my office." So in other words, instead of hiding, of turning our bodies into these private spaces where nobody's allowed to know that we are bleeding. The blood is like something that must be hidden from view. And heaven help the day I've been in that position where I traveled in white and I'm leading a research team, and you arrive off the aeroplane, it makes your body bleed more, and you're walking in to lead a scenario and you're trying to hide that now. So that thing of putting us into the space of shame, we can never be fully equal until we're able to say, the meeting will begin 30 minutes later, it's a menstrual time for Dr. Miller, and so she has to sort out her health needs, and we'll start in 30 minutes. Please read the documentation while you wait for her to become comfortable so she can lead with comfort. What seem like small issues are such important power-related issues, because now we feel I'm inadequate. I can't get to the meeting on time because I'm struggling to kind of clean my clothing so that nobody knows that I'm someone that can bear children, because that's what it's about. You should be proud of it. I'm able to reproduce the human species. My word, what an incredible thing for a young woman. but instead we are still put into that space of shame that undermines our capacity to lead with clarity and with strength and compassion. So I'm getting on my soapbox here, isn't Keitha? Sorry. Okay, people. So now we've been going since 1:30 or 1:35. So we've had a 90-minute session. We're supposed to have 2 hours. So how about we just take a quick 5-minute break, and then I want to give you a kind of nice, juicy wrap-up lecture to stretch your brains even further, confuse you some more, but not to worry, it's not core exam material. The whole purpose of the course is not about exams, right? You'll get your certificates, you do the basic things. This is an exercise of knowledge and knowledge acquisition. Okay, so I just want to push your minds a little bit more. Okay, so 3:15, let's come back and have another wrap-up session till 4.
Thank you, Doc. It's already 3 though.
It's 3, so give me 5 minutes, please. 3. My laptop